In this demonstration, we are going to take a look at the builder creational design pattern. A builder is a special type of class that is used as an intermediate step when creating an object. Let's consider a new class, and this class will be called range. And this range class will have 3 members. We'll say it has public. Actually, before we do that, let's make these all private. Let's say private int min value. We can set that equal to 0 to start with. And then we'll have a max value. And let's create one more called value. Let's make max value 100 by default, and value is fine at 0. Then we're going to encapsulate all these fields. As you can see, we have all 3 of them encapsulated now, and they're just doing simple gets and sets at this point. And the gets are fine. What we need to do is take a look at the set or mutators for each of these properties to ensure that whenever one of these changes, that the range is still legitimate. In other words, that min is always going to be less than or equal to max, and value has to fall somewhere in between min and max, inclusively. So 0 is legal for the value, so is 100, or anything in between those two. Well, let's look at the logic for min value. If the value passed in is less than or equal to max value, and let's just assume that's the only logic we need, we can make the assignment. Else, we can throw a new argument out of range exception. We don't have to get into the specifics by passing it parameters. We'll just throw the argument out of range exception. Then we probably also want to make sure that value is still within range, but we don't have to throw an exception for that one. All we need to do is make sure that value is, if it's less than the new min value, we crank it up to what the new value is. So if value is less than the new min value, well, we can just use little v for value, then value is also equal to value as such. That will make sure that if we had a slider on the screen that represented like a volume knob or something, then we could have 0 to 100 are the possible values, and maybe we have it set to the minimum, which is 0. But what happens if we change minimum instead of being 0, we make it 10? Well, clearly now value is off the range and to the left of what minimum can be. So we will just take that value and move it up to the minimum possible value, which is represented by the new min value. We're going to do very similar logic in max value, except we're going to make sure that it's greater than or equal to min value. Then we set max value equal to value, and then we want to make sure if value is outside of this new range that we crank it back down. So if max value used to be 100 and now it's 50, and value used to be 100, we also need to move that down to 50 as well. And for the value, we just have to make sure that the incoming value is greater than or equal to min value, and value is less than or equal to max value. Then we allow the assignment. Otherwise, we can throw the argument out of range exception. Let's override toString. And we'll just have a little little output here. We'll have min value, and then maybe dot dot, value, another dot dot, and then max value. So to just show us a quick little representation of the minimum, current value, and max value. And then I am going to do one more thing, which is remove the ability to call this object with a typical constructor and force us to use something called a builder to create this object. Before I actually do that constructor work, I need to create this builder class. So we'll call it public class, and you don't have to put it inside the same file. I'm just doing it for convenience. And now we can put a region here called fields and properties, so I can make this class a little easier to use. Minimize that region. And now, because once I can supply any constructor besides the default, I no longer have the default constructor. And in this case, I'm going to use, not range build, range builder. I'm going to have a range builder object as the only parameter for creating this particular data type. So unless I have a range builder object, I cannot construct a new range. So what does range builder have? Well, it's going to have very similar members. I'm going to have the min value. I'm going to have a max value. And I'm going to have value. Typically, this class will not have a constructor that accepts all of the parameters. It could, but it's not that common. But one thing it will have is this method called create that returns a new range object. And it'll say return new range object, passing it this as its only parameter. So now the only way to create a range object is to either pass a range builder object to ranges constructor, or have a range builder object and call its create method. Either way, it acts as a factory to create one of these range objects. Now before we actually make the call to create, we have to decide if we want to incorporate any business logic within this create method to ensure that min value, max value, and value are all within legal range before I bother calling the constructor over here, which may force a failure at that point. So we could say if min value is less than or equal to value, and value is less than or equal to max value, then we can return the range. Else, we can either throw an exception here, or we can possibly return null. This is something that's going to be up to you as the designer of your software to see which is the most appropriate. I have no problem with doing the same thing that's done in any of these properties of range, which is to throw an exception if one of the values is out of range. Now, maybe we would have a custom exception for this, or at least a different exception, but I'm just going to leave it as argument out of range exception for right now. So as long as min value, value, and max value are all legitimate values, then we are able to call the range constructor. Just to be safe, let's make sure we actually initialize these to zeros so we don't have to run into the problem of using an uninitialized property. So what happens if we were to call this range constructor with the builder? We have to make sure we look at the contents and then assign them appropriately to the internal values of range. So what we would need to do is say min value is equal to builders min value, max value is equal to builders max value, then value is equal to builder.value. Now, this may still cause an exception to be fired. The reason being, if min value for some reason is, as you can see, defaults to 0, but max value is 100, but let's say we decided that min value is 1,000 and max value is 2,000. By setting min value first, it is no longer going to be legal as far as our business logic is concerned. So that will yield a failure. So we have yet a little more work to do before we can consider this complete. And this is where we can get creative with our builder class. I'm going to create a new property. As a matter of fact, we should put it up top with the other properties. And we'll say public bool is valid. And we're only going to have an accessor, the get, and it is going to return this logic. Basically, it's checking to make sure min value, value, and max value are all valid at this point. Then I can change this if statement to if is valid. Let's get rid of that extra L. And we still have the exact same logic occurring. But now I can also utilize that here within range. Say if builder.isValid, then I can do the assignments. But instead of doing the assignments as such, where we say min value, max value, and value, the properties are set. This is one of those occasions where it may be beneficial to access the fields directly instead of going through the properties, thereby bypassing this logic. The reason we're able to bypass the logic is because we've really encapsulated the same logic here in the range builder. So we can say that range builder has very explicit knowledge about the range object it's creating. So maybe the business logic that is contained within range builder is the superior form of the logic rather than what is necessarily contained inside range. Again, that is something you would have to determine for yourself for your particular application. But now, because we have validated that builder does have valid information, we are free to assign these values appropriately. Otherwise, we can throw the argument out of range exception. Go back to program, and let's create a range object. Remember, the only way we can create it is by passing it a range builder. So that might not be the correct way to do this. We might want to actually create a range builder and then assign builder dot min value is equal to, let's say it starts at 1,000, builder.max value is equal to 1,500, and then finally builder.value is equal to 1,200. Definitely all satisfying our business logic. Then range R is equal to builder dot create console write line R. Let's test that. You can see there's min 1000, value is 1200, and then max value is 1500. So in reality, this range builder object is there simply to allow us to create an object almost in a batch-like manner. Maybe we don't have access to all of these members, min value, max value, and value, at the same time, and we have to construct it over several different methods. That could be problematic if we had to create range first and then pass it around to multiple method calls, hoping that everyone is setting min, max, and value appropriately at every step. By having this builder, it allows us to piecemeal it together, and then when we finally have all of our elements in place, then we can issue the create command to create our final object. This is actually a common technique when using a distributed programming technique where possibly a client and a server exist on different machines, or at least in different processes. This way, the client can piece together individual parts of the object it's trying to create, and then this builder exists as a server-side object, and then when finally the client thinks it has enough information, it requests that the server creates a new runtime object that can be used on the client. Therefore, the server has control, especially if you force it to go through this create method, the server has control over the time and the mechanism used to create our object, our target object. So if maybe a database modification was required, like say when you create a new object in a database, it has a new primary key auto-generated, then this builder would have control over that object's fate and all of its initial settings. Therefore, you're not leaving that type of work up to the client, which it should not have control over anyway.